From the opening blow at Pearl Harbor to the final order announcing Japan's capitulation, it becomes clear that the road to a deadly clash with the United States began for Japan long before the morning of December 7th, 1941. The origins of the confrontation lay in the 1930s, when an empire seeking dominance in Asia became bogged down in a draining, seemingly endless war in China. This operation, consuming massive resources, formed the first link in a chain of events ending in disaster. Japan's economy, heavily reliant on foreign imports, started to choke. Especially crippling was its dependence on oil, metals and rubber, which came chiefly from the US and European colonial possessions. The crisis escalated sharply after Japan moved into French Indochina. In retaliation, the United States, Britain and the Netherlands imposed a strict oil embargo and froze Japanese assets abroad. For the island nation, this was practically a death warrant. Without fuel, the Navy and Air Force could function for only a few months. Tokyo now faced a tormenting choice: either retreat, pull forces out of China and forfeit great power status, or seize by force the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. On top of that, the Washington Naval Treaty still limited the total tonnage of Japan's fleet below that of the US and UK. This reinforced a sense of grievance and insecurity within the Japanese High Command, driving them toward asymmetric solutions. Under this mounting pressure and sense of no alternative, war with America began to look like the only possible exit. Yet despite the glaring disparity in strength, a lesser-known but crucial fact is that many senior military and political figures in Tokyo fully grasped the danger. In private conversations and closed councils, admirals and generals conceded that Japan could not endure a long war against an industrial giant like the United States. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, mastermind of the Pearl Harbor strike, openly cautioned that he could promise success only for the first 6 to 12 months, after which Japan's prospects would become illusory. Nevertheless, the leadership pinned everything on the notion of a short, decisive campaign. The concept was to cripple the American Pacific Fleet at the very outset, seize the southern resource zone, Indonesia, Malaya, the Philippines, and then erect a powerful defensive perimeter. Japanese planners assumed that, once deprived of its fleet and forced to fight simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific, Washington would hesitate to pay the enormous cost of recapturing distant territories and instead accept a negotiated settlement. In reality, this was an all-or-nothing gamble, resting more on hopes of American psychological weakness than on any realistic appraisal of industrial capacities. Japan had cornered itself, with every option carrying extreme risk, and chose the path of aggression, counting on a miraculous blitzkrieg to offset deep structural weaknesses in its economy. The morning of December 7th, 1941, therefore marked both the pinnacle of Japanese tactical performance and the start of imperial decline. The surprise carrier-borne air assault on Pearl Harbor was executed with remarkable skill. Within hours, the core of the US battleship force, the primary striking arm of that era, was sunk or badly damaged alongside the docks. This gave Japan temporary command of the seas and enabled a rapid advance. After Hawaii, a succession of lightning operations stunned the world. Japanese troops landed in Malaya, forced their way through supposedly impassable jungle, and captured the fortress of Singapore, taking tens of thousands of British soldiers prisoner. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia and Burma collapsed in turn. Army and Navy operated in close concert, showing high levels of training and coordination. In just 6 months, the empire seized vast regions with rich stocks of oil, rubber and tin, creating a legend of its own invincibility. It appeared the plan for a short, smashing offensive had been flawlessly realized. But hidden within this triumph were already the seeds of future defeat. Instead of breaking American morale, the raid on Pearl Harbor produced the reverse effect. Rather than negotiate, the United States united around a shared desire for retribution. Pre-war isolationism vanished almost overnight. America shifted its enormous economy onto a war footing, committed to fight until the enemy's total and unconditional surrender. The attack also became surrounded by enduring myths. One of the most persistent is the claim that President Roosevelt knew the blow was coming, but deliberately allowed it to proceed to drag the US into the conflict. Historians, however, have found no solid documentary support for this theory, arguing that complacency and underestimation of Japan are far more plausible explanations. Another famous legend is tied to a line attributed to Yamamoto. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Despite its cinematic appeal, researchers doubt he ever wrote or spoke those words exactly. They were likely attached to his name after the war as a neat summary of the genuine concern among Japanese leaders about the consequences of their actions. Thus, the first half-year of war brought Japan dizzying gains that paradoxically hastened its downfall. In expanding across such a huge area, the empire overextended its lines of communication, leaving them highly vulnerable to counterstroke. Above all, it had stirred a foe whose manpower and industrial capacity dwarfed its own. What looked like a sweeping victory was, in truth, the opening phase of an inevitable calamity. The initial rush of success soon faded. By mid-1942, Japan was losing the strategic initiative. The pivotal moment came with the Battle of Midway in June. The Japanese Navy intended to lure what remained of the American fleet into a trap and destroy it, cementing maritime supremacy. But US codebreakers had already cracked Japanese naval ciphers, so the Americans were fully briefed on the plan and prepared an ambush of their own. In the resulting clash, Japan lost 4 of its finest fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, a blow from which the Imperial Navy never recovered. The destruction of ships, however, was only one dimension of the disaster. Along with the carriers, hundreds of elite naval aviators and skilled ground crews were killed. The very core of Japan's air arm, trained over many years. Unlike the US, which maintained a broad system of pilot rotation and mass training, Japan placed its hopes on a narrow cadre of aces. Their loss amounted not merely to a tactical reversal, but to a personnel catastrophe. There were no adequate replacements, and the overall quality of Japanese air power began to deteriorate rapidly. Midway was followed by the brutal Guadalcanal campaign, launched in August 1942 as the Allies' first major offensive. The battle turned into a grinding contest of attrition. For 6 months, Japanese forces fought desperately to eject the Americans from the island, but suffered crippling losses in both troops and equipment. The surrounding waters acquired the grim name Iron Bottom Sound, due to the sheer number of sunken ships. For Japan, Guadalcanal became not only a graveyard of vessels, but also the burial place of any realistic hope of holding on to the initiative. The empire had been dragged into a long war of attrition it was structurally unprepared to win. This phase also exposed serious shortcomings in Japanese naval technology and procedures. A little-known but decisive weakness was the near absence of radar on Japanese carriers, which allowed US forces to detect incoming formations first and strike preemptively. Moreover, Japanese deck-handling practices were dangerously lax. In the rush to rearm quickly, bombs, torpedoes, and fuel hoses were left on hangar decks and flight decks. In combat, a single American bomb could trigger a chain reaction of explosions and fires, destroying the ship from the inside. Sacrificing safety for aggressive tempo cost Japan dearly at sea. By late 1942, it was evident that the envisioned blitzkrieg had failed. The war had shifted into a phase where industrial strength and technological innovation would decide the victor, precisely the areas where Japan was weakest. After seizing the initiative, the Allies confronted a daunting operational puzzle: how to drive forward across the vastness of the Pacific, studded with islands that Japan had fortified into seemingly impregnable bastions. Assaulting each outpost in sequence threatened to prolong the war by years and produce catastrophic casualties. The American answer was the leapfrogging or island hopping strategy. Its logic was both elegant and ruthless. Instead of attacking every strong point, US planners selected only those islands that could host airfields or naval bases vital for the next advance. Large Japanese garrisons on adjacent islands were essentially bypassed. The US Navy and Air Force sealed them off, severed supply lines, and left them stranded in the rear. With no access to food, ammunition, or medical supplies from the home islands, these strongholds gradually became militarily irrelevant. This approach allowed the Allies to accelerate their advance while preserving their own manpower, shifting the burden of combat onto Japan's already strained logistics. Massive Japanese troop concentrations, such as the more than 100,000 men at Rabaul, were effectively removed from the campaign. Cut off on distant outposts, they could no longer influence the broader course of the war and instead battled hunger, disease, and despair. Many soldiers perished from starvation without ever engaging the enemy directly. The history of island hopping is filled with tragic details. Isolated garrisons often lost contact with higher command and with objective reality. Propaganda and the warrior code forbade surrender, so troops kept resisting even when their position was hopeless. In some locations, Japanese soldiers turned to subsistence farming in the jungle simply to stay alive. The gap between their fanatical resolve and the strategic futility of their situation was immense. This disconnect was most dramatically illustrated by the phenomenon of holdouts, men who continued living in hiding on islands like those in the Philippines or Guam for years, and sometimes decades, after Japan's 1945 surrender. They dismissed all news of the war's end as enemy trickery and carried on their private struggle in forests and mountains, while the world outside had long since moved on. These extraordinary yet sorrowful stories underscore how effectively island hopping severed Japanese forces from both supply and information, turning them into stranded remnants that could no longer halt the Allied march toward Japan's home shores. By 1943-1944, the Pacific conflict had become, above all, a contest of economic output and technological progress, one in which Japan stood little chance. The US industrial system, fully mobilized, began producing war material on a scale unimaginable in Tokyo. American shipyards launched dozens of Essex-class carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and thousands of landing craft. Aircraft factories turned out large numbers of advanced Hellcat and Corsair fighters, which outclassed the aging Japanese Zero. Meanwhile, Japan's economy was collapsing. The destruction of the merchant fleet, systematically carried out by US submarines, proved catastrophic for an island-based state. Submarines severed the flow of oil and raw materials from the southern territories back to the home islands. Factories halted for lack of inputs. Ships lay idle for want of fuel. Aircraft remained grounded due to gasoline shortages. Japan simply could not replace its losses. For every vessel the US lost, several new ones were built, while the Japanese Navy shrank irreversibly. At the same time, Japanese leaders made grave production choices, continuing to invest in prestige projects ill-suited to the new reality. For example, the enormous Yamato-class battleships. These giants consumed vast resources and fuel, but contributed little in a war increasingly dominated by air power. Unable to keep up materially, Japan's ruling circles turned to dangerous strategic illusions. Recognizing that a protracted struggle was unwinnable, they leaned ever more heavily on notions of spiritual strength and miraculous reversal. The cult of self-sacrifice, epitomized in kamikaze attacks, represented an attempt to substitute fanaticism for technological backwardness. Japanese planners clung to the idea of Kantai Kessen, a single climactic naval showdown in which the Imperial Navy would annihilate the US fleet and reverse the strategic tide. This belief functioned as a psychological shield for the high command, enabling them to ignore grim statistical realities and replace rational planning with quasi-mystical hope. At some level, the elite understood that the war was economically lost, but found it politically impossible to admit. Rather than seek a negotiated exit, Japan continued to pour its dwindling resources and manpower into the conflict, convinced that the Yamato spirit could somehow halt the American industrial juggernaut. Yet in a mechanized war driven by logistics and mass production, traditional warrior ethos could not compensate for shortages of oil, steel, and factories. By 1943, US strategists also faced an immense geographic challenge. The route to Tokyo was guarded by thousands of miles of ocean and countless atolls that Japan had turned into unsinkable carriers. Direct assaults on each strongpoint, as shown by the bloody Battle of Tarawa, threatened to drag the war on for decades and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Island hopping, championed by figures like Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur, provided a radical alternative. Rather than capture every position in sequence, Americans targeted only islands with crucial airstrips or harbors and leapt past the rest, isolating them. This created the distinctive strategic paradox of the Pacific War. Entire Japanese field armies ended up stranded and irrelevant. The fortress of Rabaul on New Britain, once the Empire's strongest base with over 100,000 troops, hundreds of planes and heavy guns, was never stormed. Instead, the Allies encircled it by occupying nearby islands and cutting all supply lines. "We'll let them wither on the vine," Allied planners remarked accurately if coldly. The results were devastating. Major Japanese garrisons on bypassed atolls, having played almost no part in decisive engagements, starved and sickened in isolation. Deprived of shipments of food and medicine, elite forces degenerated into exhausted survivors concerned only with staying alive. Officers raised in the Bushido tradition, prepared to die gloriously in battle, now oversaw soldiers cultivating vegetable plots in the jungle to stave off hunger. In strategic terms, these armies no longer existed, though they still appeared on maps. This enabled US forces to draw closer to Japan rapidly and with relatively low casualties, sustaining a tempo of operations that Japanese defenses could not counter. Isolation also took on a surreal and tragic dimension in the form of the aforementioned holdouts. With communications severed and Allied leaflets dismissed as propaganda, some soldiers refused to accept that the Empire had surrendered. For decades after 1945, the world periodically discovered emaciated Japanese fighters emerging from remote forests, convinced the war was ongoing. The most famous example was Second Lieutenant Hiru Onoda on Lubang Island, who continued guerrilla activity until 1974 and capitulated only when his former commanding officer, now an elderly civilian, travelled to the island and read him the original surrender order. Another case was Corporal Shoichi Yokoi on Guam, found in 1972 after 28 years in an underground shelter, surviving on shrimp and nuts. He knew the conflict had ended but feared capture as dishonor. Such episodes dramatically illustrated how thoroughly island hopping had cut Japanese troops off from their own state, leaving them as forgotten relics of a finished war. By 1945, the encirclement of Japan had tightened completely. The capture of the Marianas provided the US with bases for B-29 strategic bombers capable of reaching Japan's main cities. A campaign of massive air raids followed, turning the wooden neighborhoods of Tokyo and other urban centers into vast infernos. Industry lay in ruins and civilians were crushed by terror and exhaustion. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, fought at Japan's doorstep, showcased the extreme tenacity of Japanese defenses but could not avert the looming invasion. The final act unfolded in August 1945. The atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki revealed a weapon of unprecedented destructive power for which Japan had no answer. Almost simultaneously, on August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive in Manchuria, shattering the Kwantung Army, the Empire's main land force. This eliminated Tokyo's last hope of using its continental presence either to continue fighting or to enlist Soviet mediation in peace talks. The combined shock, nuclear from the air and conventional from the Red Army on the ground, broke the resolve of Japan's leadership, and on August 15th, the Emperor announced surrender. The central question is whether the speed of Japan's collapse was unavoidable. Could a different set of decisions have produced a slower or less crushing defeat? A close look suggests that Japan's structural economic frailty and flawed grand strategy made eventual failure virtually certain. Even if Pearl Harbor had never occurred and another path had been chosen, the core imbalance of power would have remained. Without secure access to raw materials and a robust industrial base, the empire could not long resist a coalition of major powers. Memoirs and popular histories often highlight fatal mistakes, such as the choice to attack the US, the defeat at Midway, or the delayed adoption of convoy systems. But these episodes merely accelerated a process rooted in the fundamental nature of the war. Japan entered the conflict with no realistic plan for victory beyond the hope that the enemy would grow weary and seek compromise. It was a contest over resources that Japan did not possess. Alternative strategies might have postponed the inevitable and perhaps increased the human cost, but they could not overturn outcomes determined by economics and geography. The rapidity of Japan's downfall was the natural consequence of trying to maintain an overextended empire resting on a fragile foundation, while challenging multiple stronger powers at once. The story of Japan's defeat shows that in modern warfare, logistics and industrial capacity often matter more than zeal or martial tradition. The empire gambled on a swift knockout blow and lost the long war instead.